Hello, a very warm welcome to Middle East Matters. I'm Sanam Shantier. Coming up on this week's programme, a conversation with Karen Attiah, Jamal Khashoggi's editor, as questions continue to linger over the Saudi journalist's murder. Syrian refugees return home, many of them worn down by tough economic and social conditions in Lebanon. Also coming up, we'll take a look at the legacy of Sister Emmanuelle, a nun who dedicated her life to fighting poverty. A decade since her death, the very people she tried to help are facing new challenges. All those stories coming up, but first, he was a former royal court insider in Saudi Arabia and one of the most influential journalists of the Arab world. Jamal Khashoggi described himself as an independent journalist, using his pen for the good of his country. After weeks of toing and froing, Saudi Arabia has finally admitted the 59-year-old was killed at the country's consulate in Istanbul. Let's now cross over to Jamal Khashoggi's editor at The Washington Post, Karen Attiah. Karen, thank you so much for speaking to us here on Middle East Matters. Of course, looking beyond the headlines, beyond the legacy, Jamal was a father, he was a partner and a friend. Tell us about the Jamal Khashoggi that you knew.
Jamal was kind, brilliant, an active mind, constantly wanting to write. And just extremely full of love for his country. And I think that's something that came through in our conversations and in his writing for the Washington Post. He didn't want to be a dissident or a rebel. He just wanted to write. And I appreciated that passion as his editor.
And this was a man who we know faced a myriad of personal challenges because of the work that he was doing, his critique of Saudi policies. His ex-wife was reportedly pressured into divorcing him. The kingdom imposed travel bans on his children, and the list really does go on, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's true. In our messages, he was most upset about the travel bans on his children that were imposed shortly after he began writing for us. He told me that the Saudi authorities were upset that he was writing for the Washington Post, but I think, there were attempts to try to lure him back to the kingdom and convince him that he would be better off in the kingdom, which he rejected and decided to stay here instead.
And Karen, you and your colleagues at the Post are at the helm of this, maybe we can call it a relentless campaign, pushing for answers. In an ideal world, what steps would you like to see the United States take here?
In an ideal world, we'd like to see for the United States, first of all, reject the so-called explanations that the Saudis have been given. In an ideal world, it's to push for the Saudis to come clean and to threaten serious consequences for murdering a Washington Post journalist in a consulate. It could be sanctions. It could be the imposition of an arms sale cancellations. But there need to be serious consequences for, if found, that this goes all the way to the top, to Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince.
Beyond that, would you agree that at this point it's imperative that the international community doesn't let the Saudis get away with this, when the fate of many other dissidents who are in Jamal's shoes could also be at risk?
Absolutely. I've been hearing from Saudis who are scared, who are frightened for their lives, that if Jamal could be murdered in this way and everyone, tries to continue business as normal, then what about them? And I think it's not just Jamal's murder. It's also looking at Saudi Arabia with the war in Yemen, the kidnapping of a Lebanese prime minister, cutting off diplomatic relations with Canada. It's looking at what sort of Saudi Arabia is happening under Mohammed bin Salman.
And that's a big question here. Does it sadden you, disappoint you that it took the death of a colleague, a revered journalist, a friend, for some of these questionable Saudi policies to be put under the microscope?
Absolutely. I think the fact that, we continued business as normal when a prime minister was reportedly kidnapped, that Saudi Arabia breaking diplomatic ties with Canada. I think what's happening in this story is that people are resonating personally with the story of just a man who wanted to get married and who walked into a deadly trap, basically. But at the same time, it means that his words are more important now than ever. And all that they've done, if they've tried to silence him, they haven't been able to kill his words. And now those are being read all over the world in multiple languages. So all they've done is just made him into a hero of sorts.
But if you look at the wider picture and look at the global climate, do you think that it's likely that Saudi Arabia can recover from this? Because, of course, Jamal Khashoggi's case is currently in the headlines, but would that die down and Mohammed bin Salman resume his activities?
Mm-hmm. I mean, that's always the risk. However, this seems like a different sort of inflection point. I think now I'm hearing from Americans who don't really know that much about the Middle East or Saudi Arabia and who hadn't heard about Jamal's name, who are furious and they tell me they can't get this out of their minds. So particularly if this becomes an election issue for the midterm elections coming up, this is something that I think senators, Congress are furious, over this. And so I think this only adds fuel to those who've been calling for a fundamental rethink of the U.S.-Saudi relationship. It only gives much more ammo to their cause. And so I don't think it can be business as usual with Saudi Arabia from here on out.
Karen Attiah, global opinions editor at the Washington Post, hoping and thinking it won't be business as usual after this scandal completely unravels. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us here on France 24. Now, thousands of refugees have been returning to Syria from neighbouring Lebanon over the past months. This as Bashar al-Assad and his backers appear closer to winning the conflict. Among those making an emotional journey home, Naama and her children. Here's a look at their story.
Every week, dozens of Syrians gather in this stadium near Beirut, just like Naama and her children. After several years of taking refuge in Lebanon due to the war ravaging neighbouring Syria, they've decided to return to their homeland.
We're happy but hesitant at the same time. There the prices are high, there's no work, life is hard. But thank God in our region, it's calm. Our house is still standing, our relatives live there, on our land, with our animals. It will be fine, thank God.
What's your name? Let Naama on board, one by one.
Naama is returning alone to Hama province, while her husband will stay for a few more months in Lebanon. A difficult farewell as she heads to a country they left nearly 6 years ago. For several months now, the Lebanese and Syrian authorities are coordinating to organise voluntary and free return trips to Syria. Rawad and his family are heading back to eastern Ghouta, near Damascus, an area that was retaken by government forces at the beginning of the year.
What can I say? I feel a lot of emotions. I'll see my house again. I'll see my fields. Honestly, I cannot describe these emotions.
All of Rawad's possessions are in these bags. He must fight a bit to be sure to take everything with him, as nearly 150 refugees are boarding this bus today. But Rawad is leaving behind his 3 brothers. They will join him a couple of weeks later in their family home, where their father is waiting impatiently for the return of his children.
I was depressed when my children left their homeland. I cried when I spoke with them on the phone. Thank God, 2 have already returned. I hope that the others will follow. When my children are back with me, I will be the happiest man alive. I don't need anything else.
As a tailor by trade, he's now looking for work since his former workshop was looted. The expensive living costs in Lebanon and the Syrian army's victory have pushed him to return home. However, the number of people going back is minor compared to the 5 million Syrians who fled their country due to the war, some 1 million of them to Lebanon. And since many fled the destruction, they have nothing to go back to in Syria.
It's been 10 years since the death of Sister Emmanuelle, dubbed the French Mother Theresa. The Franco-Belgian nun was known for her work among the poor in the developing world, most notably the so-called garbage people in Cairo's slums. And without her, challenges are piling up for the majority Christian community. Peter O'Brien has the story.
The Zabaleen, or the garbage people, have been Cairo's informal rubbish collectors for around 80 years. 70,000 of them live among the refuse they collect and recycle. Conditions are extremely poor, but it's a tight-knit community. Over 90% of them are Coptic Christians, a rare example of a majority Christian community in Egypt. In the midst of the piles of waste, an oasis. Set up 30 years ago by French-Belgian nun Sister Emmanuelle, this school is a bright, clean sanctuary for around 3,000 pupils.
If it wasn't for this school, I might have not completed my education. I might have only reached prep school or not even joined any school at all. I wouldn't have joined university or become a teacher. I don't think I would have completed my education or done anything.
During her 20 years living among the Zabaleen, Sister Emmanuelle was instrumental to making life in the slum better. Thanks to her, a large number of children began schooling, violence was reduced, and access to medical treatment, electricity and fresh water improved. The founder died 10 years ago at the age of 99, but memories of her persist.
Sister Emmanuelle used to sit, talk and eat with us. People were happy. She was the reason their children went to school.
Times are hard for the school. Since Egypt received a loan from the International Monetary Fund 2 years ago, the government has imposed harsh austerity measures and prices have soared. In 2015, almost a third of Egypt's inhabitants were living in poverty, but now the situation is believed to be even worse. The school doesn't charge tuition fees for its poorest students, but keeping children there is difficult. Many families can't afford to properly feed and clothe them, or buy school supplies. Teachers there are intent on keeping Sister Emmanuelle's legacy alive. She was known for saying Yalla, which in Arabic means move on, move forward.
Well, that's it for us this week. Don't forget, you can reach out to us on Facebook and Twitter. That's Middle East Matters France 24. Thank you for watching.